Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel Wolbers. I'm going to be moderating this very exciting panel. Hopefully, we can keep the mood a little bit light, even though we're going to be talking about cybersecurity and cyber threats. But I'm really excited to be here and to be joined by this wonderful panel. I'm just going to quickly introduce the three of them, and then we'll get started. So way down on the end is Diane Ronaldo. Diane actually used to be my old boss when we were both at the Department of Commerce.
So she's very excited to ask me the questions.
Yes, I've got really tough questions for her now. No, Diane was the acting administrator of the National Telecommunications Information Administration. And now she is at Beacon Global Strategies, and she's the executive director of the Open RAN Coalition. Next, we have Jim Lewis, who is the Senior Vice President at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Previously, he was a diplomat and has been working on tech and security issues. And then finally, we have Dara Murphy, who is a Senior Advisor at Rasmussen Global, former Irish Government Minister for Data Protection, and European People's Party Vice President and 2019 EU Election Campaign Director. So thank you all for joining us. So today we're going to talk a little bit about cyber resiliency and the reasons it's needed to protect democracies. And when we talk about cyber resiliency, we're referring to an organization's capacity to anticipate, withstand, recover from, and adapt to cyber threats and attacks. And obviously, this is important for every industry, as well as governments, and also citizens. Every person should be thinking deeply about their own cybersecurity and cyber protections and how they can become more cyber resilient. Unfortunately, as we've heard many times throughout today, the world is getting less and less safe with the advent of new technologies such as AI and even quantum. There are more and more risks to our cybersecurity, and all individuals and organizations have a range of tools that they can use to ensure that they can protect themselves and become more cyber resilient. Some of those tools include technologies such as encryption, and encryption has become a little bit of a hot topic on both sides of the Atlantic. We're seeing the EU, the UK, the US, and the Australians and others looking to weaken encryption in order to have more law enforcement access to data. So we're going to talk about why encryption is so important to protecting our democratic processes, why it's important to ensuring trust in our democratic institutions, and how what people can do and what lawmakers can do to ensure cyber resilience. So that was a long introduction, and let's get started with some questions. We're going to take questions from the audience with about 10 minutes left. So if you have any questions, please do keep them to the end, and this great group of panelists can help answer them. So our first question looks at, how are governments, companies, and citizens implementing best practices to ensure that they are resilient in the face of cyber attacks? And how does this impact democracies and democratic values? So what is the interplay? Why are we talking about this here at this conference? Maybe Dara, I could start with you.
Great. Well, thanks, Rachel. And first of all, it's a great pleasure to be here. I've been coming for a number of years, and thanks to Prime Minister Harper and all of you. I should say I was campaign director for the centre-right EPP in 2019, elections that we won, and hopefully we will do the same next June. You hear an enormous amount of conversation around cybersecurity in a vague, opaque way. But the transatlantic context is, of course, the most important because, like it or not, Europe and the United States, if we can agree on rules, we tend to set global standards. And when I was data protection minister, it always struck me that the real difference from North America, maybe less so Canada, certainly the United States and Europe, is the value that we as Europeans put on privacy, whereas the Americans more focused on freedom of speech. And there are many areas where the Americans and the Europeans broadly agree but don't completely agree. But there is one space where we have got to get our act together, and that's in the space of security. And now cybersecurity plays, of course, the most important role in that. So yes, you do hear a lot about organizations, governments, cybersecurity officers, representatives of government being aware that we need to do more to protect ourselves as citizens, our organizations, and our governments. But conversely, what you are seeing to an ever greater extent is one of the key, or some of the key elements that protect our societies through our devices are being undermined by other pieces of legislation, unforeseen consequences. And you have mentioned pieces of legislation like the Digital Services Act. You see it in the United Kingdom, you're seeing it in the United States. And where we need to move rapidly is to a point when we don't look at security as an afterthought. So currently, and rightly so, we are looking at environmental consequences on all pieces of legislation in the European Union. But we do not do it for security. And if you look at certainly elements of the Digital Markets Act and other pieces of legislation, security seems to be less important than securing Europe's digital future, than our ambition for digital leadership to make markets freer and more open. And I think this is a starting point that we really need to address, that you can't talk about cybersecurity if you, on the other hand, and I would be critical here of Europeans and the British as well, and some elements over on this side of the Atlantic, they are ignoring the existing ecosystems that we have within certain products that actually start with the starting point of being more secure. And there is a danger when you try and open everything up that you neglect. And for me, that is the biggest single problem that we are seeing. Good intentions from people like the French, who want a new sort of a strong French global leadership in tech, but at the same time, not enough awareness that actually, we need to protect the ecosystems and the security of the devices that we have and that we use. Last point, because of course, nowadays, cyber attacks are attacking the fundamental values of democracies. They attack our freedom of press. They attack our health systems. They attack elections. And tools like encryption actually protect our citizens. So if you create a backdoor into a system that allows a state agency get access to data, frequently for very good ideas, the backdoor is now there. And the bad guys can also come in the back door. So it's a discussion that needs more consideration. Too simplistic. Europe legislates too quickly. Not enough thought. The French have a presidency of the European Union. Digital Markets Act, Digital Services Act, 3 months, and they're law. And it's not good enough.
Yeah. Dara's mentioned a number of different proposals and some of the legislation that we're seeing. Jim, you have worked on encryption and cyber resiliency issues for a very long time. I'm wondering if you could tell us what some of these unintended consequences might be of weakening encryption and how that could undermine our broader cyber resiliency.
So one way to think about resilience is it's really a question of trust. It's a political question. And so you have to have trust, in this case, in your data, in your devices, in your networks. And so one way to ask about this is what I'm doing increasing trust in those things? Because if you don't trust the system, it's not going to be resilient when it comes under pressure, right? I started out thinking encryption was bad, right? So I used to work for Uncle Sam and would have gladly, one of my last assignments was going around the world persuading governments to ban encryption or to put limits on it. And I would still think that was a good idea with one little problem, and that is I was checking in preparation for today. 2 billion people have now downloaded end-to-end encryption. You don't get your hands around a 2 billion person market, spread around the world. So we have to live with encryption. We have to live with end-to-end encryption. And there is, as Dara was saying, it's not a black or white thing. We've tried the laissez-faire approach. That's one of the reasons the Europeans are on the warpath. We also don't want to move into too much regulation, right? And the question is, how much is too much? Something you have to work out. It clearly has to be balanced. There are good arguments for restrictions, but there are better arguments probably for thinking of ways to keep people having access to end-to-end encryption. I don't really know what the answer is. I've been thinking about this for a long time. Originally, we went through all sorts of shenanigans. We had, some of you remember Clipper chip, bad idea, right? Some of you might remember PKI, which is still sort of a term of art in encryption. But the idea is you could find a trusted third party who would hold the key and only give it up with a warrant or something like that. The dilemma we had there, at least in the US, was nobody wanted to be the trusted third party, right? Nobody wanted someone else holding their key. So I think encryption is something we have to live with. And the question is, it comes with risks, it comes with benefits. Are there ways that we can mitigate those risks? Are there ways that we can think about, the term of art now is CSAM, if you know what that means. And it kind of fits in with the gloominess of some of the earlier panels. Child sexual abuse materials. You don't want that. But at the same time, you don't want to create, I don't like the term back doors. They're usually not back doors, they're usually front doors with a key. But you don't want to think of weakening the encryption. So I don't really know how to find that balance. And it's something that we're going to have to work towards. But if 2 billion people have something, you're not going to get them to give it up.
A lot of the conversation today has talked about geopolitical issues, the threats from both Russia and China. We know that Russia in particular, and China as well, have very active state-sponsored cybersecurity attack centers. Diane, I'm wondering if from a geopolitical perspective, if you can talk about how protecting cybersecurity from the transatlantic perspective can really help bolster and create better institutions globally, knowing that there are these big threats coming.
Yeah, so to kind of even go a little bit further back in my my background, my resume, I was the first hire at the House Intel Committee to focus on tech, telecom, and cyber from a public perception. I was the only person that was allowed to come to the events like this and talk about these issues. I was not an Intel person. I was a tech telecom person dropped in that world because they understood back in the early 2010s how important it was to start communicating these things to the general public. But these conversations had been happening behind closed doors, but it was time to start bringing this to the people because cyber is not just about companies, it's about everyone. Right now, especially now that we're to the digital of everything, it's all hands on deck to protect our cyber footprint. And at that time, the pervasiveness of the Chinese in IP theft was just becoming known to Congress. You know, maybe the intel agencies knew this was happening, but even members of Congress were supposed to be privy to this information. They were just starting to become aware. And my boss at the time, Mike Rogers, who's the chairman of the House Intel Committee, used to get asked to go on TV a lot. So he'd always say, well, I want to talk about cybersecurity. And they're like, sure, we'll get to that. He would never get asked a question. And so we'd always joke that the common media really never cared until all of a sudden, as you may recall, back in 2012 timeframe, New York Times, Washington Post started to getting hacked, and they were looking for their sources. Authoritarian governments were looking to find out who their sources were that was passing along information about these regimes. And so now that it has come to a front burner issue, it's great to see that there's more, there's definitely a better knowledge base. Administrations have dedicated, not staff, but teams that are focused on this, including the Department of Homeland Security, who has, I think, they're up to 1,500 people under CISA now. But it is so incredibly important to our geopolitical posture. We need to protect, and Dara mentioned it earlier, and it's absolutely right, the integrity of our elections. We need to protect our economic well-being, and this requires resiliency, which takes all of us. So it's incredibly important to keep focusing on these issues. When we talk about encryption, and encryption was one of my top issues that I dealt with at the committee, and again, right, being a government person, working for the Intelligence Committee, I was able to see firsthand how important it was to have strong cybersecurity practices, and including encryption. And it is important to be able to articulate the importance of law enforcement, but also the importance of the security aspects as well.
Thank you. So we've been talking a little, we've been talking a little bit about not only cybersecurity from the side of stopping crimes like identity theft and fraud and ransomware, but really focusing on how we use cybersecurity to protect our fundamental rights. With Vice President Pence talking about how important, as conservatives, it is for all of us to protect these fundamental rights. And democratic institutions are really one of these important institutions that we need to protect. So I'm wondering if the panel can talk a little bit about why this is more of a fundamental rights issue. I know that we've all probably been on many panels talking about identity theft and CSAM and ransomware and these other bads, but how does strong cybersecurity really protect freedom of speech, freedom of press, as Diane mentioned, and others? And Dara, we'll start with you, but anyone can feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, you know, we're all of a certain age, everyone's getting older, but the reality is security and cybersecurity are not the same thing. Mm-hmm. You see in every conflict, the first attack is, you know, on government systems, but then of course there are the other attacks that, you know, attack individuals, and then, you know, the whole issue around fake news, media, and all of that. So, I mean, the fundamental freedoms that we have in Europe and the United States are actually, in a global context, shrinking. So democracy, unfortunately, in our world is proportionately becoming smaller and smaller. And the rights that we take for granted won't necessarily even always be available to ourselves. So, not wanting to sort of to frighten people, but I mean, you can imagine a Europe, you know, in the 30s, where if certain governments had access to religious data about groups of people, mm-hmm. How much more efficiently they could have performed their terrible acts. And equally, if we in the democratic parts of the world, and including, of course, Australia and Japan and New Zealand and Canada and many other countries, you know, if we can't set the norms and keep the standards high, particularly when it comes to technology, where we collectively, more the United States than Europe, but nonetheless, we still lead globally, mm-hmm. Then we are allowing much worse governments, and potentially occasional governments, even in Europe and what we call the West, actually to take advantage in a way that will really impact on our societies. Mm-hmm. And one of the realities when it comes to technology in particular, and this is what sort of worries me as someone who works in Brussels and has been involved in legislation before like GDPR, is that security in particular, because it's a national competence, so we have 27 member states, but security is kept by the member states, really. So is foreign policy. Mm-hmm. You know, that's why Europe doesn't have a strong foreign policy, because it's not really a competence. So we have competence in trade, we have competence, so that's, you know, you see things like the Digital Markets Act and so on. But we don't really have a joint approach in Europe to security or foreign policy or even defense. And that means that we don't talk about security in what is, and let's be fair, the European Union is a superpower of one thing above all else, and that is regulations and laws. No one comes close. But still, even within the massive resources we have, and we had Executive Vice President Dubravka Svika here from the Commission, security is frequently not on the table, and it's not on the table because the member states want to keep it in the national capitals. The Germans, the French, previously the United Kingdom, security is a national competence. And there's a danger in that, because our legislation, California has recently adopted a law very, very similar to GDPR. Other parts of the world take European law because, you know, it's such an industry there. But if we don't pay more attention to the consequences of security, we have a problem. In my country, Ireland, we had decided we were not going to push forward with body cams on police personnel and other types of technology until we had a very nasty incident a couple of weeks ago. and the public realized, oh, actually, the police need body cams. And my fear with some of the policies that have come out of Europe is it's not going to be until something really terrible happens that we say, we didn't really think of that security issue until, God forbid, it's too late.
Yeah. Jim, anything you want?
Great. Switch the line. Oh, sorry. Good. Switch the line, please. So the question really is about encryption. Nobody disagrees with the need for encryption. It's on your phone, it's on your bank account, it's on your Gmail. It's not bad, you know. The question is the issue of access. How do you get access to encrypted data? Who has the right to access to encrypted data? End to end is there's one person at one end and there's another person at the other end, and they're the only ones with the rights to access. That immediately falls into some problems, right? But it is the alternative that people worry about. The question we're asking is, what is the leash on the sovereign, right? Because left to their own devices, states would collect information. That's why you have requirements for warrants. And a good question for any country is, under what conditions can your security forces collect information on people? I went to one Latin American country where the way they answered it was, it was the colonel. I walked down to the phone office and I told them, hey, can you put a tap on this guy? We want a little more rules than that, right? So what are the conditions that you can get access to, right? And the flip side of that is, under what conditions should governments not have access? And there's no single answer. There's no right solution. Each country has to work it out for themselves. But encryption is here to stay. I think getting back to the trust point, if you don't trust your government, you're not going to be happy with them having access. And one of the debates that comes up, the other side to getting a warrant is surveillance. And surveillance is code for covert collection of data by intelligence agencies. And that's what worries people much of the time. What are the rules under which that happens? Can you have global rules? Can you have global agreement? I'm not sure what the answer is. When you put restrictions on the use of encryption, people find ways around it. But as I said at the beginning, it's not like something, we can't go back. I was at the start of some of this stuff when we could have said no encryption. For a variety of reasons, we didn't. It was really funny. At that point, the internet had about 100 million users, and they were almost all American. And we could have said no encryption, but we chose not to because of the risks to privacy, to freedom of speech, to cybersecurity. We didn't call it that then, but that's what it is. And we are still struggling with how to find a process, a balance between these concerns. My impression, and so I'd be interested in what the other panels think, is we're talking about a balance, but the drift is in one direction. The drift is towards greater and greater use of encryption. I think we just have to live with that and accept how do we make it work for democratic governments.
No, you're absolutely right. There's been a greater adoption as time goes on. Jim and I have been working on these issues for
15?
Yeah, something like that.
Well, a while.
A while. And in that time, talking 10 years ago, we're like, there are future technologies that are going to arise, and it's really going to impact our posture. And here we are in 2023 discussing artificial intelligence and quantum computing. I mean, it's here. It's not, technology never stays static, nor will it ever. So that's why it's important to continue to improve our security posture. And you're right, like it's not going to go away. We just need to maybe change the tone of the conversation.
I'm very proud of all of us that we made it 24 minutes into this panel before artificial intelligence was brought up. I feel like I was like getting itchy at a tech panel without talking about AI. So I am going to follow up on your question, Diane, about AI. I have been working with folks around why encryption is important to the development of AI industries. As all three of our panelists have been saying, to ensure that we have strong cybersecurity practices that goes down even to the individual level. So even what's on your phone, the only way to really do artificial intelligence and to have get the full benefit of what AI can do is to have lots and lots of data. And so to make sure that you've got the right data to use AI and find new solutions using AI, you do need strong encryption practices as well. But I'd love for Diane and others on the panel to talk a little bit about how AI and quantum, which you mentioned, really impacts our cyber resiliency, and what should lawmakers do to protect their citizens as this technology develops? Or even what should organizations or people themselves do?
Yeah, so I mean, it's what makes us stronger can also make us weaker. And I think when you're talking about AI and quantum, that both kind of fits in that bucket, right? My day job, I focus on secure telecommunications networks, and AI is a big part of my conversation, how AI can be used to detect anomalies in networks, how it can help with spectrum sensing, make more efficient uses of spectrum. But there's also concerns about how it could manipulate our digital ecosystem to be less secure. So again, as these new technologies come online, I think this is why it's so incredibly important to maintain our security posture, always work together to figure out new ways to improve information sharing, which is how Jim and I met each other, is have conversations on information sharing. I think continues to be one of the most important things that you can do. So you're sharing best practices, you're sharing anomalies, what you're seeing come across your network. But yeah, again, I think what makes us stronger can also make us weaker too. So
I'll turn it over to these two, but after both of them give their answers, we're happy to take questions from the audience. So Jim, go ahead.
Two things are happening that you ought to be aware of and probably shape other parts of the conference. The first is we're getting close to a ubiquitous global network based on IP, and it'll be fiber optics, undersea cables, satellites, 5G, wireless. No place on Earth will not be connected to a communications device, and that device will have access to unlimited data, almost unlimited data, and unlimited computing power. That's been a change just in a few decades, and it will continue. So first question is, can we think about how we govern this ubiquitous connectivity? The second thing, and this was something Diane brought up, we're past the point where you can turn the switch and dial this down or turn it up or something, even with Brussels trying to regulate it. There are now so many scientists and so many innovators and so many people who are willing to invest in it that the process of innovation is self-sustaining, right? And so when you think about this ubiquitous network, people are going to continue to push it out. And what we've found, this is a cliche, governments choose to be slower than the rate of technological change. And that's a democratic choice, possibly a mistake. But we need to think then, in this world of ubiquitous connectivity and continuous change, what are the rules? What are the rules for access to data? Who has access to data? That's the encryption question. Under what conditions do they have access to data? And are those conditions transparent? And do you believe that people will actually follow the rules? If you can answer those questions, you have a good idea of where you stand on encryption. But I was kidding them earlier. I asked ChatGPT what would be a good answer for this, and it said something like it's both at once simple and complex. It's like, thanks, you're not that intelligent yet. More to the point, though, we have to think about how we develop perhaps more flexible methods to govern largely unstoppable technological change, part of which will be the balance between access, who gets access under what conditions, and encryption, who has the right to deny that access.
Yeah, I mean, once again, the European Union is charging boldly forward with the Artificial Intelligence Act. I believe, I'm told, and this is Chatham House, I know it maybe isn't nonetheless, that there was a little bit of an ideological tug of war in the Commission between those on the one hand who wanted to drive ahead with the European regulation, to get ahead of the curve, to be the first to react to artificial intelligence, and the other wing who through the Transatlantic Technology Council, which has been working well between the Europeans and the Americans, wanted, to co-regulate, to say, look, this is too big, too new, has massive potential, but also we have concerns. Unfortunately, it seems like the European driving on under Commissioner Breton seems to be winning, and I think that's a shame. Our own political family actually, I believe, will be making the issue of too much regulation, too much law, and too quick regulation a big issue in the next European elections. We need to stop putting burden on our businesses, particularly our SME sector. And that includes many of these bigger headline pieces of legislation as well. But trust has been mentioned by everybody, and trust is the problem. One of the biggest problems politicians have to accept is our own citizens often don't trust our own governments, whereas they do sometimes trust companies and businesses and social media networks that they're on. And one example that we've been wrestling to way back when I was in government is the issue, and it was mentioned, about electronic evidence being transferred from one jurisdiction to another. The Europeans and the Americans still can't agree an electronic evidence agreement framework, despite the fact that electronic evidence is now used in every case, I imagine, globally, or certainly a large number of them. That is a huge political failing, and it goes to trust. And it's something that, that has to be sorted out. And it's yet another example of where the big blocs, they talk the talk. They've announced recently we have to get an electronic evidence agreement in place so that evidence that can convict very bad people in Europe can be transferred to the States and vice versa. But when it comes down to brass tacks, they can't agree the legality.
By the way, we're the cheery panel, so
Yeah.
I just want you to bear that. We all agreed coming up.
We came on to be fun. That
Yeah,
was right. Yeah.
So, did you have something you want to
just-
ask, other than that we're not very cheery?
This is actually a big strategic problem for the U.S. in that our most important ally, we have, the UK, Japan, Korea, Australia, Canada, and the European Union. Europe is the biggest. Its digital regulations kill economic growth. No one disagrees with the need for regulation, right? But the way they've done it, there's really good data at MIT, at Harvard, at other places that show that European digital regulation kills economic growth. And that means while we agree on the need for regulation, our most important ally is becoming weaker. And you can see that. People used to say that China was going to displace the US. That's not going to happen. What is happening, though, is China is going to displace Europe, and that's not in our interest as a nation.
We're going to take some questions. I think
That's definitely not
there's
cheery.
one right here.
I should
There's
say,
Mike coming around. Oh, yeah.
Hello, Mongolian Democratic Party. Thank you, IDU. I have a question with the cyber resilience, but in a different context. We're talking about cyber resilience and cyber security. With Asia and Asia Pacific, we've been having a lot of influence campaigns from Russia, from Japan, Korea, and China. And previously, we've seen disinformation influence campaigns to Taiwanese as well. So my question is, how would party would position itself and posture itself in building the resilience posture to fight these campaign influences so that we can have fair and free elections to our people? Thank you.
Want to answer that? Go ahead.
So I recently had the pleasure of traveling to Taiwan, and it was about a month after I believe Nancy Pelosi had traveled. And so they were relaying a story to me that after she left, there was a cyber attack which shut down all of their 7-Elevens. We chuckle, right? 7-Eleven, get a snack. Well, in Taiwan, it's where they shop for their groceries. It's where they do banking. It's really, they're everywhere. It's their center, their community centers. And so they were sending a message with the Speaker of the House traveling by shutting down their centers of their communities. So I think it's incredibly important, especially in the South Pacific and Indo-Pacific areas, to ensure that even places you might not realize that might be a necessity for the community are in fact necessities, and the adversary knows this. You may not, but the adversary knows it. Rachel had mentioned cyber attacks going on, and I think you said like insurance, some travel,
Ransomware,
again, you might not understand why they're pinging these certain areas, but they know what they're looking for, and that's a problem. That's why it's so incredibly important for us to have these conversations, to bring together a diverse group of people to figure out how do we move forward, because it is global, as Jim said, we are globally hooked at the waist, hooked at the phone, and it needs to be all hands on deck.
Dara, I don't know if you want to answer.
I mean, this isn't going to be a particularly helpful answer, but you probably know this. But I suppose that it's like everything. It's like defense. When it comes to defending with your military, it has to be resourced. You have to get the people in to look at your systems, particularly your government systems. Many cyber attacks are successful because of poor human behavior, actually, which can be addressed. And the second is information, education and information. To provide people with counterbalancing education and information, starting, I would suggest, at a young age. But it's like pushing a boulder uphill. I don't think any organization, any government will ever be sort of cyber-proofed. I remember one of the things when GDPR came in first. It was so transformative, particularly for governments. We were wondering, how are we going to get all these institutions to change their practices to be much more aware of citizens' data? But we didn't really have to worry about it because that provision had eye-watering fines, like really big fines. Now, I'm not suggesting you have very significant fines for people who don't put in proper cybersecurity, but certainly there has to be, particularly for governmental organizations, health organizations, energy providers, we also do have to look a bit at the stick to say, you have a responsibility to protect the people you serve within society, and if your systems aren't robust enough, then I do think there has to be greater punitive action. That's easier, I suppose, as you move into richer sort of countries where companies and public services can resource and bring in consultants. But they're my kind of three areas: carrot, stick, and education.
I think we have time for one more question. Yeah.
My name is Lionel. I'm from Canada. Thank you so much for tackling such a complex problem. I know it's not easy. I've supplied lots of technology across Canada to sub-sovereign governments, so to the different provinces, and that particularly has to do with student data. I know a lot of our school systems have been under attack with ransomware attacks, and these things are very expensive for these systems, and they're ill-equipped to prepared to actually deal with them. What would your recommendations be for governments that are trying to build their capacity to be able to respond to these things? Like, do you have a roadmap that you would recommend? Because what we found as a private company trying to operate in this space is that a lot of governments just don't have the capacity to even get their heads around these issues and have these conversations, and it's complex as we've seen today in this panel. So,
well, there's some easy things you can do. One easy thing is move wherever possible to third-party service providers. And so if you go to some of the big cloud providers, they compete on cybersecurity, they do better. And there's people always say, well, I'm nervous about giving them my data. That's an encryption issue. Don't give them data without encrypting it. But rely on third-party service providers. Now, I'll tell you that with a grain of salt, which is that the Chinese and the Russians have figured out, hey, that's great. This Lewis guy just said rely on third parties. Let's hack the third parties. So that's a lot of the big hacks we've seen recently. But that's step one. Step two, there is kind of a plan, and if you look at the executive order that came out in May 2022, it has a number of steps that are intended to drive IT companies, many of whom are American, to have better practices. So you might have heard of SolarWinds, which was a big hack here where the Russians got in through a third party. And it turned out then when examining what happened in SolarWinds, I had the CTO of one of the big tech companies say, I learned not to code this way when I was a sophomore in college. Basic coding, secure software development, those are going to be crucial steps. Authentication, do they use multi-factor authentication? You all have it, you should have, if you don't have it, get it. You know, where you go to your bank account and it texts you a number, right? That we know from studies by places like the Australian Signals Directorate that this sort of basic hygiene can reduce effectiveness of attacks by about 80%. So there are things you can do. The final thing is a little tougher, which is if you live in a house and you let a guy stand outside the house and continually throw rocks at you, you're going to end up with broken windows, and it doesn't matter whether you do any of the stuff I just said. So how do we engage with Russia, China, Iran, North Korea? How do we get them to change their policies? It's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be without risk, and so that will take a long time. But there's things you can do at the individual level. There's things that only states can do, and we're sort of drifting in the direction of doing all those things.
Awesome. Well, our time is up, as the screen is very, very visibly telling me.
Very
but
red.
I like that we're ending on some practical advice, even if the last one was a little bit difficult. But thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you, Rachel.